For context, I was on the economic advisory team of President Gorbachev 34 years ago. I was an advisor to President Yeltsin 31 years ago. I was an advisor to Ukraine's President Kuchma 30 years ago. I was an advisor to President Yushchenko about 27 years ago. I know this story from the beginning. This is a story about NATO expansion. And this is a story that you will not read in the mainstream media. This is a story that the US government works overtime to hide and to dissemble. And this is most unfortunate. Most governments don't tell the truth about anything anymore, but I wait for the United States to tell the truth about anything anymore, because I do not believe anything that comes out of Washington these days about this war and much else, unfortunately. Sad to say, this is a war that could readily have been avoided at so many times, because first the Soviet Union and then leaders of Russia said over and over again, do not expand NATO to Ukraine. Is this such a hard concept to grasp? I think we should just contemplate if Mexico and China make a military alliance, the United States is not going to say, and Prime Minister Trudeau is not going to say, well, that's their choice. It's an open door. They can do what they want. That's pretense or arrogance. I don't know which for sure. But the United States has said, we don't care what Russia says about what we do. And it is formal NATO policy, stated repeatedly. Our decisions of where we go cannot be influenced by third countries, period. So NATO assumes that it can move to anybody's border without complaint or response. If you want to know why this war occurred, that's it. That's the one sentence explanation. The rest is details. And of course, people will say, oh, that's so wrong, Professor Sachs. What happened to you? Are you crazy? Because that's what I hear from people who read the New York Times each day. Because that's what they're fed. Because we're fed stories. I'm sorry I was there at these instances. I was actually there. Professor Kachanovsky is the world expert on what happened at the Maidan. I was there the day after because I was asked to be there by the next government, and it was explained to me how the US NGOs, so-called, funded the protests on the Maidan, paid for it. Oh, we'd feel great if the Chinese paid for the January 6th demonstrations in Washington. We'd say, oh, that's just fine. Well, the United States paid for the Maidan, but you won't read about it in the New York Times. So, okay, we live in a world of lies, and the United States is run by confidentiality except when somebody leaks stuff. But everything is supposed to be secret. So let's just disentangle for a few minutes what actually happened. What actually happened is that starting in 1989 and 1990, the United States and Germany repeatedly, explicitly represented to Gorbachev that NATO will not move 1 inch eastward towards the Soviet Union if the Soviet Union disbands the Warsaw Pact. And you can go on the National Security Archives of George Washington University. The article is called What Gorbachev Heard. And just look at it online. You'll find about 30 archival documents that tell the truth. So the U.S. promised no NATO enlargement. And you know what? I'll tell you a secret among the 427 of us. The United States lied. Because already starting in 1992, there were full plans for NATO enlargement, including, by the way, Ukraine as early as 1992. I recently spoke with a leading historian who's working through archival materials. He explained to me Ukraine was on the list already in 1992. Because the U.S. is arrogant. I'm sorry to tell you another secret, if we can just keep it among ourselves. The U.S. believes it runs the world. It's the sole superpower. And it can do what it wants. And because of American values, we can do whatever we want. Whether it's subversive operations, overthrowing governments, launching wars on false pretenses, bombing Belgrade, bombing Libya, doesn't matter. But don't expect to get the straight story, because you won't. Starting in the mid-1990s, there was already a detailed account of what the timeline would be. If I can pull up an article, I'll try while we're talking. I just want to quote to you from Zbigniew Brzezinski, who laid out in a foreign affairs article, which is a kind of way that the insiders explain to the New York elite what's really going on. And he wrote already exactly the game plan. And I think it's just funny to read it. Let me see if I can find it. Okay, so here's Brzezinski writing in 1997, September-October issue of Foreign Affairs. He says, quote, "Accordingly, NATO and EU enlargement should move forward in deliberate stages. Assuming a sustained American and Western European commitment, here is a speculative but realistic timetable for these stages. By 1999, the first 3 Central European members will have been admitted into NATO. By that he means Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic. Although their inclusion in the EU will probably not take place before 2002 or 2003. It was 2004. By 2003, the EU is likely to have initiated accession talks with all 3 Baltic republics. And NATO will likewise have moved forward on their membership as well as that of Romania and Bulgaria, with their accession likely to be completed before 2005. Check the box. Between 2005 and 2010, Ukraine, provided it has made significant domestic reforms and has become identified as Central European country, should also be ready for initial negotiations with the EU and NATO. It happened in 2008. In other words, Brzezinski's not speculating. Brzezinski's telling you the plan, and he's laying out what is going to happen. Well, this plan did not sit well with the Russians. They said, no, do not move NATO to our nearly 2,000-kilometer border with Ukraine. Do not do it. The United States is deaf. So first came the first 3 expansions, and then, as you heard, there were 7 under George W. Bush, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Slovakia, Slovenia, Bulgaria, and Romania. Then in 2008, okay, drum roll, the U.S. insists that Ukraine and Georgia will be members. And if you look at a map, all they're doing is playing out Brzezinski's plan to surround Russia in the Black Sea. Because with Ukraine and Georgia, you have Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia completely surrounding Russia in the Black Sea. That's the plan. It's not even subtle. So Putin said in 2007, look, we want to cooperate, we're trying to cooperate, but don't keep expanding NATO, because you said not 1 inch eastward, and now you have it's 10 countries, and now it's going to be 12, and then it's going to be 14, and you're surrounding us. Okay, again, the United States didn't listen. But there was bad luck for the U.S., which is the Ukrainian people did not want NATO expansion. If you look at the opinion surveys, and just go on Wikipedia to take a look, because they're all collated in Wikipedia, the surveys at each date, about 10 surveys, large majorities against NATO enlargement. And President Viktor Yanukovych was elected and became president in 2010, and he pushed for Ukraine's neutrality. And he pushed for Russia to have a long-term lease till 2042 in Sevastopol and the Black Sea region, where the Russian fleet has been based since 1783. That's a good reason to overthrow him, which is what the U.S. policy became by the end of 2013. So when protests broke out over Yanukovych's delay in signing an EU accession agreement, and whether those protests were originally provoked or originally spontaneous, I'll leave it to Professor Kachanovsky to help us understand. But soon they were militarized and paramilitarized by really violent groups, especially from Western Ukraine. And we know from a taped intercept on February 6th, 2014, Victoria Nuland discussing who the next government is going to be 2 weeks later. And she describes on the tape her partners back in Washington. Who are they? The Veep, that's Joe Biden, and the Veep's national security advisor, that's Jake Sullivan. So the team is the same team as in power right now that played the overthrow of Yanukovych. Now, when the overthrow occurred, I got a call, oh, come to Kiev and meet the new government. And when a government asks, I went. And when I went, the Maidan was still swirling with people, and a U.S. person explained to me, oh, how the U.S., they were so proud how the U.S. had helped finance these demonstrations. This was an NGO explaining how much money they had put into financing the demonstrations. It made me sick, by the way, to know this, the contrivance and the role of the United States in the overthrow. Okay, we're not allowed to talk about any of that, so please keep this to ourselves. It's just 467 of us. But you will not read about this at all. Then we know the war broke out, not in February 2022. The war broke out in February 2014. And again, Professor Kachanovsky is by far the authority on what happened in Odessa, what happened in Crimea, what happened in the Donbass. But already this was civil war, and already by 2015, NATO was pouring in weapons. And there was a UN-backed attempt at peace, especially the Minsk II agreement, and supposedly co-guaranteed by France and Germany. And the Ukrainians brazenly, this new Ukrainian US NATO-backed government just said, we're not implementing that. So they signed it, they didn't implement it. Angela Merkel said a few months ago in a quite notorious interview, oh, no, it was just to buy time for Ukraine so it could strengthen itself. Well, billions of dollars of weapons went in. Biden came into office, and Putin put forward a draft security agreement in December 2021 that was to be an agreement between NATO and Russia on security arrangements. calling for, at the center, stopping the enlargement. I spoke to White House officials, a senior White House official at the end of 2021. I said, avoid the war, for heaven's sake, stop the NATO enlargement. Do you get it? This has been the issue all along. And I was told, never, we will never negotiate over that issue. NATO has a, quote, open door, just like I'm sure we'd say with Mexico if it allies with China. I can't say the real word that applies to this because it's not in polite company, but this is not grown-up behavior. This is provocation of war. So in the middle of January 2022, the U.S. formally rejected any discussion about NATO enlargement. And if you read the minutes of Russia's National Security Council meeting on the eve of the invasion, and the meeting took place, I believe it was the 21st of February, you can see all the statements. They're all about NATO. Putin opens, he says, we tried to stop NATO enlargement, but they weren't serious, and the United States is without any credibility whatsoever. And then Lavrov speaks next, and he describes the negotiating process and how it failed, and that the NATO countries were unwilling to discuss the disposition of NATO. Okay, that's the war. The war broke out. Within a month, Zelensky said, you know, maybe we could be neutral. And negotiations started in Ankara with Turkish mediation. And I spoke to the Turkish mediators. I spoke to people who were deeply involved in this. There was rapid progress made on the basis of Ukrainian neutrality. Then, one day, the Ukrainians showed up and said, no, we're taking a pause from the negotiations. The best estimate given to us by former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett in a very interesting long interview that he gave online a couple of months ago said, yeah, the U.S. stopped it. He said, I didn't agree with them, but they thought that they needed to be tough towards China, that it would be a sign of weakness to go along with this. Honest to God. Honestly, it's worse than 5-year-olds. And so the war continued, the negotiations ended, we've had another year. They don't care about the lives lost in Washington. They don't care. Even Romney wrote an article saying this war is great. Russia is losing, Russia's being bled, and not one American life is being lost. He actually had the stupidity to write that, or the evil to write that. Okay, that's the story. If we want this war to end, we got to negotiate, and it's got to be based on no NATO enlargement. There is no other way this war will end. Why? Because if Ukraine is victorious on the battlefield, Russia will use nuclear weapons. And if Ukraine fails on the battlefield, well, the whole thing's moot. And the third option is the war goes on forever, which is American-style wars. Yeah, sure, we can just fight forever. If we want peace, we actually have to tell the truth, which is that there are limits to NATO enlargement. And I'm sorry to say, Canada is absolutely an accomplice to this. And what's a shame for me is I grew up in Detroit, Michigan. Canada was due south for me, so you were my southern neighbor in Windsor. I always regarded Canada as the sane part of the continent because I knew that the United States was the crazy part of the continent. But I'm not seeing in Canadian leadership now any honesty about this at all. I'm sorry to tell you. And I've had some interactions that I don't like, because this is all gung-ho militarism. And as Bianca said at the opening, the foreign minister, it was the foreign minister, right, Bianca, who said, this is not the time to talk about peace. This is the time for war. We don't have diplomats anymore, ladies and gentlemen. We just have diplomats trying to prove that they're warmongers. We don't have any diplomats because life doesn't matter. It's Ukrainians there. And the Ukrainians, well, they are suffering beyond belief. Their government has gambled everything of their country on the U.S. backing. It's a terrible gamble. I tried to tell them, ask the Vietnamese, ask the Nicaraguans, ask Afghanistan, ask Libya, ask the Syrians. Is it great to gamble with the U.S. as your backer? Not so good.
Of course, we have a deadly hot war raging in Ukraine, and this is a war ostensibly between Russia and Ukraine, but it's actually a war between Russia and the West being fought by Ukrainians in Ukraine. So unfortunately, this is a war between superpowers, especially Russia and the United States. It's a kind of contest that went terribly wrong over who would control the politics of Ukraine. And Ukraine itself is a complex society, but the United States already 30 years ago had the idea that it would push not only U.S. influence, but the U.S. military alliance, Nato, towards Ukraine. It made that a formal goal in 2008. Russia said, no way are we going to have a U.S. military alliance on our border. Stay away. And that's a red line for us. And so we've had a confrontation building now for a long time. I saw it very early on because I was actually an economic advisor to President Gorbachev. I was an economic advisor to President Yeltsin. I was an economic advisor to President Kuchma, who was the first president of independent Ukraine. So I've seen it from both sides. And this confrontation, unfortunately, has been underway. In my view, which is not a very popular one, the U.S. simply failed to show any kind of prudence for 30 years. The Russians kept saying, we don't want your military alliance on our border. Do you hear us? No. Do you hear us? No. And this went on and on and on. In 2008, George W. Bush Jr., in his final year of office, pushed NATO to commit to Ukraine's membership in NATO, and Putin was furious and said so to George Bush. In 2014, the United States participated in the overthrow of a pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych. That actually started this war, because this war didn't start in February 2022, as is often said in our media. It started in February 2014, actually, with the overthrow of Yanukovych. After that, the U.S. poured in weaponry. Russia supported separatists in eastern Ukraine, where ethnic Russian populations are concentrated. And we've been at war, in a proxy war, for 8 years. At the end of 2021, just to bring us up to date, President Putin tried a final time with Biden, saying, our red line is NATO enlargement. We need to negotiate. And Biden said, no, we're not negotiating over that. That's Ukraine's right to join NATO. And the war intensified with Russia's invasion on February 24th, 2022. I find all of it utterly tragic and utterly dangerous. Tragic for Ukraine, because while the Ukrainian leaders say, yes, we're going to win, they're actually caught in an unwinnable situation. They're trapped in a superpower war. I warned, I know some of your listeners are probably Afghani. I said, you're going to make Ukraine into what happened to Afghanistan over decades, again, caught in a proxy war, in a war that was only a tragedy for Afghanistan. Now we see Ukraine being pummeled in this way. And I think the U.S. Just has been terribly unwise. I don't like what Putin has done, but this has been a building confrontation. And that's the sad part of it. And by the way, if you analyze it politically in this way, it also gives you the sense of how to get out of this, because what really needs to happen is Joe Biden needs to pick up the phone and say to Putin, we've heard your red line. NATO is not going to advance to Ukraine. Now you get the heck out of Ukraine. And that's the basis of how the deal could be made.
Just on that, because you said in a recent interview as well that we're not using diplomacy. In this current situation, you know, how important is diplomacy? You've talked about how it may be the way to the solution and kind of peace in this scenario, but how important is that, and taking into account the fact that we've already engaged in this aspect of war as well?
Diplomacy is crucial. It is the art of solving interstate problems peacefully. It is the art of ending conflicts, which don't just come because people are crazy. They arise over political conflicts. The issue in Ukraine has a number of political conflicts. I put the issue of NATO first and foremost. I would put the issue of Crimea, which is a complicated historical issue, second. I would push the Donbass, Eastern Ukraine, ethnicity issues third. But in any event, there are political issues. To solve politics by war is very unlikely. For instance, General Milley, who is the chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, said last month, Ukraine is not going to win all its military objectives. Oh, don't say that. That violates the narrative of the politicians. And, of course, this idea of you don't need diplomacy, you just need victory on the battlefield. In a world of nuclear weapons,
exactly.
Whoa. What kind of thinking is this? I have to say, by the way, I've often said, I think it's right that the two most militaristic countries of the last 2 centuries are the UK and the United States, because these have been the two big hegemonic powers.
Well, one thing I want to ask is about the current economy of the world right now. But before that, this concept of sanctioning and boycotting. Obviously, we've had Western nations say, let's harshly sanction Russia, boycott Russia. And it's weird because 45% of Europe's gas comes from Russia, and it's causing all sorts of problems. And the average person on the ground is suffering. So my question is, in terms of economy of the world, is it even possible to block out such big nation states like Russia and just say, okay, we're not going to deal with you, because we're in a global village now? And so I just want to know that economic perspective.
When I was an advisor in Russia in either late 1991 or early 1992, I went over to the energy ministry one night at about 10 at night. And I was shocked because all the lights were on, all the workers were there. And I said, what's going on here? And the minister said to me, but Mr. Sachs, we cover 11 time zones. So in Vladivostok, on the Pacific coast, it's already morning. So of course we have to work throughout the night. Russia's not going to disappear from the map. It's 11 time zones. It's a major global power. It is a major resource exporter. So a lot of what was said at the beginning, that we're going to bring Russia to its knees through these sanctions and so forth, I thought was extraordinarily naive, because I've seen sanctions regimes by the U.S. It's a favorite policy instrument. It's war by a stroke of the pen because it creates a lot of destruction, but it doesn't involve troops on the ground, and it can cause deaths through the collapse of the healthcare system or other things in countries. But the American public doesn't know anything about it, so a president can do it on his own. In any event, very rarely does it have the political outcome that the U.S. Thinks it's going to have. So I said at the beginning, these sanctions would not work, and they would have a boomerang effect. Because like you say, we're going to show how tough we are. We're going to cut ourselves off from our energy supply. Brilliant. Brilliant. So now Europe is going into a recession. Russia is exporting to Asia, to India, certainly on a large scale, to China on a large scale. And most of the world is not on side with these sanctions. These sanctions are the so-called Western world, which is the US, Canada, UK, European Union, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Korea. That's about it. It's about 20% of the world population. 80% is not on side on these sanctions. And so you're not even isolating Russia in this story. The whole thing has been dreadful, especially, by the way, for Europe, and especially within Europe for Germany, because Germany built industry on the basis of low-cost natural gas. The United States kept saying, don't do that, don't do that. I said, why not do that? That's what international trade is. Russia exports its gas, Germany exports its industry. That's a mutual gain.
I just want to bring this home for a second. So what's your opinion on countries like the UK, the European countries you mentioned, US, spending millions, if not billions, in funding the war in Russia at the moment, when people at home are starving? Here in the UK, we've got this huge cost of living crisis. Lots of people are going to food banks. I'm a doctor, and today is actually a nurses' strike in the NHS. Next week we have the paramedics striking as well. So there's a huge kind of cost of living crisis. Household items have shot up. Petrol is more expensive. Yet nations continue to spend money and go to war, whereas at home, we're kind of suffering as a population itself. What's your opinion on that?
Well, look, first of all, it's not just billions, it's trillions. So the world is spending $1.5 to $2 trillion of armaments. By far, the biggest spender is the United States. U.S. Congress is about to pass something like a $900 billion defense spending, so-called defense spending. It's pretty offensive in my mind, but in any way, I would say a $900 billion military budget. And that doesn't even count the CIA, the intelligence agencies, the Homeland Security. So we're spending well over $1 trillion just in the United States. And we also have people suffering. And then the politicians say, oh, no, there's no money for that. So this is a completely outmoded way of thinking. It's a very dangerous one. As I say, I think Britain got used to it because it was at war for a long time. There's a famous map of the world that people have seen. I think it's the 23 countries that Britain never invaded, something like that, because the British military has basically invaded almost everywhere over the course of history. We are not in the Crimean War, although they want to make it the Second Crimean War. Or maybe I should put it a different way. We shouldn't be in the Second Crimean War, and our politicians should know better, because the First Crimean War didn't solve any fundamental problems either. So we're wasting our time, we're wasting our money, people are suffering, and there was a way to avoid this war, and today there is a way to end this war through negotiation. And it starts with the self-responsibility of NATO saying, okay, we get it. If Russia leaves, we don't go in. That's the words that need to be said.
I think it's also important to mention here, just almost ending, but you disagree with Putin's moves as well. Like, people need to realize that as well.
Of course.
You're blaming the NATO expansion. That makes sense, but you also disagree with Putin going in and causing this war.
Of course I do. And what I said strongly at the end of 2021, and I tried to push it to the White House also, is avoid a disaster that's about to happen. I have no sympathy for a Russian invasion. It's horrible. But I have no sympathy for the U.S. not taking the steps to avoid it or to end it. So this is both sides. The main point when you have this brawl, separate the two brawlers. And that's what can end the fighting and make Ukraine safe again.
Thank you. Just to end, I want to talk about interest under the current capitalistic model, because a lot of economists, war experts have said that the reason you can have long wars is because nations can borrow money, which is of course based on interest. They don't have to tax so harshly because they can just borrow the money. So therefore your population isn't affected so much. Even though that, the British taxpayer ended paying off World War One loans just in 2015. However, obviously interest enables that. And the reason I ask this is, as Muslims, a lot of people will know that in the Islamic paradigm, interest is strictly forbidden. It's because of how you can manipulate people, you can control people as well through interest, and nations, in fact, because they're in debt to you. And also, interestingly, the Quran says that interest will lead to war as well, which is
interesting.
Very
interesting.
And that this is quite explicit as well. And of course, we're at that stage where we're seeing that. So I just want to, as an economist, take your view on the role of interest in this whole global warfare, which we've been seeing for decades now.
Let me put it this way, if I could. For millennia, wars were fought by princes who sent the average peasant to death. And the princes viewed this partly as their game or their glory, but it was the people who were suffering. Then we thought, or maybe sometimes it was thought, that democracy would stop this. I found it interesting to think that Britain was perhaps the most democratic, or nearly the most democratic country in the 19th century already, but also the most war-making, because there's a difference of domestic and war-making. So you could have some democracy, and Britain developed some democracy in the 19th century, real democracy, and yet it made war everywhere because it was plundering abroad, because it thought empire was grandeur, empire was wealth, and so forth. Then we thought, well, now we'll hold our leaders accountable. And that comes to the question, well, if you can finance things with debt, or if you're not accountable because you can put on sanctions with the stroke of the pen and no one asks, that breaks down too. So I would ask the basic question, first of all. Are the people in Britain or Europe or the United States well informed about the causes of this war? I would say no. That's first point. Second, did this war come from below or from above? Both on both sides, whether it's the Western side or the Russian side. This was a war from above, not a war from below. This wasn't the public clamoring for war. This wasn't intrinsic hatred. This was leaders making decisions. Now, the public was ill-informed. The public was told a false narrative, and maybe the public went along at the beginning. But now, where are we? I don't think the American people like this war. They want negotiations. I bet that in the UK, people want negotiations more and more. I just heard in Germany of a very recent poll showing a big majority of Germans want negotiations, but their government officials do not right now. So I think that there's a complete lack of accountability at the top. And in the US case, a lot of foreign policy is in the hands of a very small group. It's in the hands of the president. It's in the hands of a small group in the executive branch. It's in the hands of a small group in the Congress. And it's in the hands of the so-called military-industrial complex, which is a few businesses that make the weaponry. And there is this view of a small elite that this war is good or in U.S. interest or okay or profitable or many ideas. But it's not the view of the American people, who, by the way, have not been told the truth about this and don't have even a mechanism to hold the government accountable, because Biden is about to get another maybe even $40 billion of money to the war without any separate vote on it, because he's going to stick it in an end of the year big package that has to be voted in order to keep the government functioning. So they're afraid even of a debate on this issue.
I guess just to re-emphasize the point, so if Biden is getting that 40 billion, how is that amount even possible?
Like you say, it's that's the Treasury will go borrow this money, and normally it used to be the job of Parliament anywhere, was the main job of Parliament even in how Parliament rose, which is to say to the sovereign, to the king, you can't fight that war or raise money without our vote. Yeah. And now we don't have that because, well, the Congress is going to vote, but it's going to vote on it as one line item in thousands. And I spoke to some congressmen about this. I said, now we need a debate because the American people need to know about this, and we need to say that negotiation could end this war. He said, no, there won't be any debate at all, because it's just going to be a piece of a package that's going to be pushed through without a debate. China went from being a very poor country to a quite developed country in 40 years, and for 1.4 billion people. So this is the biggest single change in the world economy in a very, very long time. And it is the first time. Well, Japan was the only case for a long time of an Asian country that achieved even industrialization. But this is something different. Now, East Asia is a powerhouse economically, and China is, of course, with nearly 20% of the world population, and with an economy that is, depending on measurements in purchasing power terms, bigger than the US in absolute size, and in market prices, smaller than the US, but in either event, a major economy. This is something new in the world. It's a good thing overall for the world, because China went from poverty to development, and China in 2,000 years has played a major role in world civilization. And I'm glad to see China back on its feet. The reason China was so poor is part of this story. They call it the century of humiliation. China made one terrible mistake, the worst economic mistake of any country in all of world history that I know of. And that was in 1433. So 600 years ago, they stopped their naval fleet, and they became an inward-looking country. And then 350 years after that, suddenly Great Britain started knocking on the door, and China realized we're behind. And then in 1839, Britain launched the war
for the freedom to export opium to China. Mind-boggling. So the opium wars are the opium wars for a reason, which is gangsterism, which was a large part of the British Empire. And from 1839 to 1949, it was complete disaster for China. 2 opium wars, the Taiping Rebellion, the Boxer Rebellion, Civil War, Japanese invasion, Civil War. So by 1949, China was completely impoverished from having been a world civilization for 2 millennia, impoverished. China then, without a long story, the first decades were complicated, but starting in 1978, probably the greatest economic reform in history of scale took hold under Deng Xiaoping with the opening of China. And in 4 decades, China went from impoverishment to a highly innovative, dynamic economy. The big problem, in quotation marks, from the US point of view, is they became powerful, but not under our supervision. The Americans have the audacity to say, we believe that they would become a liberal democracy like us if they develop, but that failed, so now we have to confront them. That's the American mindset. It's a little ignorant because China's statecraft, centralized state, is not about the People's Republic of China or the Communist Party of China. It started in 221 BC. Centralized state. It started with the Han Empire. So this is a long story. Americans don't care, don't understand it. Now, your question is, what does it mean for China and the world? If we have peace, which I'm counting on because I can't imagine the alternative, I hope and look forward to China being a highly prosperous, dynamic, outward-looking country that is a pillar of the international system. I would like Europe and China to have good relations and to deal with each other. China will not be a democracy in the form of European parliamentary democracy. It will have its own statecraft. There will be imperfections like there are anywhere. It's not our business other than to have good discussion about different options and so forth. But we should have good relations with China. We should work together. We should analyze common problems. We should say, you have wisdom of 2,000 years. What would Confucius say about this? What would deep Chinese values say about this? It sounds silly, but I think it's a very serious point. I'm hosting a meeting in Athens of Confucian and Aristotelian scholars because I want to know what both those philosophers, what their philosophies can add to our modern problem solving. I actually believe a lot because they teach us about order, virtue, basic human nature questions. So my view is engage with this remarkable civilization. Be thankful that it has escaped from poverty, that it is innovating. I'm grateful, for example, that Chinese scientists developed the most effective treatment for malaria that we have from an ancient Chinese herbal treatment from Qinghua So, which we use the extract artemisinin, which is saving millions of lives every year in Africa and Southeast Asia because of what a Nobel laureate Chinese scientist developed of an ancient practice. Well, there's a lot of that can come. I was delighted. I mentioned yesterday that downstairs nearby on Gran Via, there's the Huawei building. Okay, I went to Huawei. My wife and I visited Huawei a couple of times. We went in 2019. Incredibly impressive. So impressive that the United States insisted on shutting them down. Why? Because they got better at 5G than any US company. That's why. And then the US said, well, they can spy on us. That's not the real answer. The real answer is if it's an American equipment, then the US can spy on me. If it's Huawei equipment, it's a lot harder for the US to spy on me. So the fact of the matter is the US just tried to shut down Huawei because they made beautiful, low-cost 5G systems for developing countries that were going to sweep the world. And so the US had to go threaten everybody. Don't do business with them. So this is the first Huawei store that I've seen in a long time. You wouldn't find anyone in the United States. But the point I'm making is let us engage constructively. And China has a huge amount to offer for the world. And if we engage, it's not going to take over the world. And by the way, aside from many other reasons why China's not going to take over the world, China's population is going to fall by about 400 million people in the next 80 years. China's going to become old. I kind of appreciate that these days more than I would have before. But I also really feel old people don't want to take over the world. They just want quiet, you know? We want peace. We want nice. And that, I think, is what China will want as well. We need China to open and for Chinese businesses to be traveling outside. And I need to get back to China, frankly. It's been 3 years, and I need to get back so I can see friends and brainstorm on these issues together. We really need to reconnect the world economy. We really need to stop the nonsense of decoupling, which is a wrong-headed idea. Our interconnections are good and important for us. We can't solve problems on our own. We need actually to see a scale-up of programs like the Belt and Road Initiative, because China is out there saying, we will help our neighbors and even some distant neighbors to invest in infrastructure, digital, energy, transport, so that we can be interconnected together. This is a fantastic thing. By the way, it creates a lot of jobs. China exports a lot of the infrastructure, the machinery, the technology, and others do as well. So those kinds of investment-led programs are extremely important. And I think China has a major role to play. You know, there was a lot of attack from the outside on the Belt and Road Initiative, almost all of it wrong, most of it for geopolitical narrative reasons, because it's an important and positive initiative. Within China, there were doubts or loss of confidence in this approach. Well, are we just pouring money into something that doesn't make sense for us? But actually, it's an important initiative, and I really hope that it goes forward strongly. It should be, of course, a green, sustainable Belt and Road Initiative. But China has a huge role to play in helping to build the 21st century infrastructure in ASEAN, in Africa, in Latin America, and so forth. And that will be very good for China's economy and very good for the world economy.
Professor Sachs, you chair the United Nations Millennium Project to develop an action plan for meeting the Millennium Development Goals, which many of them concern the environment. You're also president of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network launched by the United Nations. What's your biggest take from your extensive experience? Are we doing things right, and are we doing the right things?
Well, no, unfortunately, it's very hard to do this right because it means changing at the global level what we do. And we do what we do at the global level for reasons of economic incentives, profit motive, geopolitics. And we know we're heading towards a cliff, a climate disaster, for example. We have to change direction, but changing direction globally is a hard job. It requires a lot of global goodwill and cooperation among the major governments. That's why every day I say stop the war, negotiate an end to this craziness and disaster, and cooperate. That's why I say every day that the United States needs not to view China not as an adversary, but as absolutely a cooperative partner in a great global struggle for sustainable development, like climate change or biodiversity, where there is no alternative, really.
Professor Sachs, I want to ask you about China-US relations. The year 2022 has seen quite a bit of ups and downs. Your prediction for China-US relations going forward?
There is a battle in the U.S. between hardliners, so-called neocons or neoconservatives, and those who want cooperative relations with China, which is a lot of us and a lot of the business community as well. That battle continues. From the neocon point of view, the idea for the U.S. is to contain China, stop or slow China's progress, actually, hinder China's access to technology, and ensure that the United States remains number one. That's their vision. To my mind, it is mind-boggling, harmful, dangerous, provocative, can really get us into conflict, and unimaginable. Who wants to contain China? What a terrible idea. What we want is economic progress that goes around for the whole world, actually, and everybody can get ahead in a safe and sustainable manner. So the idea that the world is a zero-sum struggle, which is the neoconservative idea, is absolutely wrong. The world is a place where we're all in it together. We face some very big crises and common challenges together, and where economic progress can be spread. It's not one against the other. So this is the battle going on in U.S. foreign policy. I believe that the right approach absolutely is for the two sides to meet each other, to establish again a structured, strategic dialogue. Because there are a lot of complicated issues. These are two giant economies with a huge sway in the world. They should be talking to each other carefully, in detail, not throwing charges in the social media and sound bites and provocative trips like Pelosi took over the strenuous objections of China. No, this should be a relationship of mutual respect, of prudence, and of a lot of dialogue, and where necessary, of some hard negotiating as well. But that's what's going to get us to be able to prosper together and to solve problems together. What I'm hoping comes out of it is a structured, ongoing, intensive dialogue. And of course, I very much like and promote so-called track two dialogues as well for all the rest of us, that we're making as much contact, discussion, and analysis together as is possible.
Yeah, I mean, foreign policy starts at home at U.S. midterm elections, where the Democrats lost control of the House. How much weaker does that leave President Joe Biden and his Democratic Party? And what do you think it would mean for America's foreign policy making, especially its China policy?
It leaves Biden weaker in that it will be very difficult, very unlikely for Biden to pass any significant legislation going forward. Even legislation actually supported pretty broadly and by both parties, because the Republican majority in the House of Representatives will not want to give even political victories, even if they support the substance, to Biden, because now in the U.S. mindset, we're already in the presidential elections for 2024. So there's always a look, what does this mean for the next election? So in this sense, I think Biden is actually considerably weakened. There won't be major legislative packages, most likely. There will be investigations on many issues in the House of Representatives because of the Republican majority. They'll aim to tie up the administration in many ways. But with respect to Chinese foreign policy vis-a-vis China, I'm not sure that this has any decisive play, because I would say it's the dominant position of both parties right now to take a hard line towards China. It's not wise. It's not the right foreign policy. It's not serious in my view, but it's what is continued in 2023. It may make a push at the same time, though, towards more negotiating, more support for negotiations, I should say, in the Ukraine war context, because a lot of the Republican side is far less enthusiastic about continuing to pour tens of billions of dollars of finance and armaments into Ukraine, and actually believe, as I do, that we need a negotiated outcome.